the hearing on House Bill 287, establishing a committee to study decriminalizing sex work. And the chair calls on the prime sponsor, Representative Rep. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm the prime sponsor.
You're looking at the bill that's above. Okay.
I'm going to do a second though.
Chair calls the prime sponsor.
Yes, that would be me. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Good morning. It's really nice to be back in front of Senate Judiciary. I don't get to come here too often. So this bill creates a study committee to look at our current laws on prostitution, the effects of those laws, and the potential costs and benefits of other laws we might implement. The current version of this bill was the result of 4 subcommittee meetings in House Criminal Justice that turned a somewhat more radical bill into the moderate language you see before you today. I do want to draw your attention to the fact that the amended title of the current bill is different from the title you see in the docket. So it is, the whole bill was replaced. So the new title is Establishing a Committee to Study Issues Related to Changing Prostitution Laws in New Hampshire. I'm on my 4th year in the House now, and by now I've voted in favor of a few study committees. Study committees are not completely free. We do pay for the mileage of committee members and costs like copying and printing. So I don't think that literally every single study committee bill should be approved. My criteria when I'm voting on a bill like this are twofold. 1, is it an important issue? Is there enough evidence to privilege the hypothesis that there is a problem? And 2, is the committee balanced? Are they likely to hear all sides and get all the information they need? Sometimes a study committee bill is written in kind of a slanted way so that only 1 or 2 perspectives are heard. I think that my original language satisfied the first criterion of importance, but honestly, it didn't satisfy the second criterion of balance. And that's why I think that the amended language agreed on by House Criminal Justice is actually an improvement over my original language, as much as it, hurts my ego a little bit to admit that. So this committee will examine the issue of prostitution from multiple perspectives. It would look at the harm reduction perspective. It would look at the law enforcement perspective, the public health and safety perspective. It would also look at it from a trafficking perspective. And finally, it would look at it from the perspective of sex workers themselves. One of the reasons that I think this issue is worth studying is that there are a lot of expenses and costs associated with our current laws, and only some of those costs are obvious. Even the direct expenses of arrest and incarceration are borne by the taxpayers at large, which makes them less salient. But law enforcement and correctional expenses are not the only cost. The economic mobility of women is severely hampered when they are arrested for prostitution and their names and mugshots become public record in the local news. The black market created by our laws makes criminals much harder to find and catch. Women in the sex trade who are attacked, robbed, or raped are afraid to go to the police because they know they could be arrested for prostitution. We are, in effect, under the current system, telling them that their lives and experiences don't matter, that they don't deserve access to the criminal justice system because of the choices they've made to survive and feed their families. I think that is an important problem that deserves study. The question the study committee would address is, can New Hampshire do better? I think that it can. But if our current laws are the best we can do, an honest look at the evidence from all perspectives will reveal that too. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Questions, Board Representative? No? Thank you for your testimony. Chair calls Representative Jeff Edwards.
So I have written testimony. Do you want it now or after?
Now would be great.
So for the record, I'm Representative Jess Edwards, representing Rockingham 4, Auburn, Chester, and Sandown. I'm the junior legislator in the family. The Representative Edwards that sat down before me is my oldest daughter. I jokingly tell people that I ran for the House in order to counterbalance my daughter's votes. As it turns out, we vote opposite of one another more than twice as often as we vote together. And so today is kind of an opportunity to stand with her on a bill, and I kind of like to explain why I think this bill is worth your support. I'm going to read my written testimony for the record and for the people in the back, if that's okay. It should take less than 2.5 minutes.
Because we will read it.
Okay, but it's got so much great impact. I will try to. That was yeah. Well,
I'm reading this. This is very good work.
Thank you. That's really what I was looking for, Senator. Okay, so to paraphrase this, I through some volunteer efforts in Manchester, came to know a woman that I'm referring to in my testimony as C, to protect her privacy. Even though she's passed, I think her family still deserves that respect. And it happened that I came upon her at a local convenience store several months after I met her through this charitable event. And she recognized me, and we started to talk. And I was really surprised that she recognized me, because she was clearly stoned, high on something. And so I was concerned about her health. We kept talking, and she just was spilling out her life story to me, and it really tore me up.
Okay, take your time.
The next time I saw her was in an obituary. So the reason I support this, we got young people trapped. All we've got is a punitive system at this point and once these people who are connected to drugs and addiction get into that cycle, they don't have a way out. And the state is not helping them, because we basically have a punitive system. And it's designed to enforce our laws, certainly. But I think once a young person gets criminalized and has a record, they can't get out of that hole. They're in that hole the rest of their life. And I would just hope we could find a better way. The study commission has a couple components of it that I think could do that. This is personal to me because my dad, in the Depression, was raised by his two older sisters, who worked as sex workers. So I know my family has recovered from having to engage in sex work in the 30s. And had they been criminalized, had my dad been criminalized, because as a 13-year-old he was required to work, because everyone worked. He had to work to support their services. I won't go into details, but 13-year-old boys should not be doing that for their sisters. And had he been criminalized, his life would have been ruined, I think. He went on to achieve great things and set us up for success. I can just imagine that cycle, though, that would have sucked us down as a family. Sorry.
Apologies needed. Anything further?
Well, to the governor. I happened to be talking to the governor about a different issue in his office, and he volunteered after we were done that he talked to my daughter earlier, and he said that he had been opposed to this bill prior to talking to her, but that she brought up some really great points about harm reduction and the role of the state to worry about harm reduction, and that it made him think about some things differently, and he told me that he would not oppose this bill. So as long as this bill is alive, I think there's still some hope. So.
Will you take questions?
Sure.
Any questions?
Okay.
You're off the hook. Thank you.
Thanks.
The chair calls Representative Hall. Sarah Hall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Hull, serving the towns of Bow and Dunbarton. Here in opposition to the bill, but I want to talk about both what I'm turning in, as well as I believe there is some things that need to be done. So, for the record, when the bill came through the House, I opposed it. I think our current laws do create issues in terms of the current punishments. They need to be fixed. Okay? I believe the current laws actually potentially impact trafficking in a negative way. That needs to be corrected. I'm not sure the committee as proposed and the makeup of the committee as proposed actually will get us the correct solutions that we need. So my concern on this is, unless we put together a committee that actually has the right members, we're not going to have an outcome out of that committee that is useful for the legislature to work with. So the committee makeup as it, and this is the reason I opposed the bill, and the goals need to be rewritten. Studying the effects of human trafficking, studying the connection between human trafficking and drug abuse, and a couple other things are all valuable. But that's not what the bill says. And I'm looking at strictly the text of what we're studying and the makeup of the membership. So that was the reason I opposed it. Secondly, my testimony that I just turned in terms of written testimony has to do with where the state, the businesses, the education institutions are going as a whole. We're trying to fill career placements. We're spending a lot of time trying to address the unmet needs in terms of workers in the workforce. What I see is I don't see sex work on the list of unmet needs in the state. We have manufacturing needs, we have IT needs, we have a bunch of jobs that aren't being filled right now. This is not on that list. This is a recent study talking about what community colleges and businesses are trying to do to solve the shrinking workforce that's available because of a shortage of qualified people. If we're going to put time into studying a particular occupation, these are the occupations we should be studying. If we're going to study the trafficking issue, okay, and the unintended consequences of our current prohibitions, okay, that penalize potentially people who are caught in trafficking situations with misdemeanor level crimes, we should address that. But this bill tries to merge those two, and I'm not sure those two ideas are compatible. I don't see this as sex work. I see we have to study the harms of our current laws. That is something that should be done. I also see that we should study occupations, but I don't know how to merge these two concepts into a common bill. So for both of those reasons, I oppose the bill and would encourage you to take a strong look at trying to solve the real issues of people who have been caught in trafficking situations because they're addicted to drugs and how to get them out of that. With that, I'll close my testimony.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you.
No? Thank you. The chair calls Darrell Perry.
Thank you. I will be incredibly brief. For the record, Darrell Perry, CEO of Lobby LLC. Representative Elizabeth Edwards gave a little bit of the history of how this bill came to be. Originally, the bill was a bill to decriminalize prostitution, and the House committee said this is something we need to study. And now you have a bill before you to actually study the issue. And if you've got a committee saying we need to study this, then study the issue. I don't want to get too far afield of why I think the original bill should have been passed, because that's not the bill before us. So I support this, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Questions? Thank you for testifying. Bella Robinson.
Good morning. My name is Bella Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Rhode Island chapter of Coyote. And I've provided you some documents. The first is a list of the credentials. I've been recognized as an expert in trafficking, sex work at 7 universities throughout New England. I've also been a sex worker for 35 years, and I've done sex work in both Rhode Island and the state of New Hampshire. My younger days as a sex worker, my first arrest was 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. And to give you some context, I'm 53 years old right now, and I still make my living as a sex worker. I did spend many years addicted to drugs with substance abuse problems, in and out of jail. I went to prison twice. I have been exploited by vice officers, sexually assaulted by correctional officers during my 5 years in Florida DOC, and in October of last year I celebrated 10 years clean. So as it seems, sex work really wasn't the problem. The problems were drugs and really poor decisions that I was making in my youth. Much of this was about that I had no contact with my community. I was very isolated. It was not safe to tell the police or social workers or someone when I wasn't in exploitative situations. Luckily, I was able to get out of them. So the reason that this is really important is we have no doubt that there's many levels of empowerment in sex work. We know some people have mental health problems, addiction problems, but when we focus on pimps and just traffickers, we don't have to talk about economic inequality, lack of affordable housing, lack of jobs that pay a living wage, and then a huge majority of sex workers are poor mothers. I've had a great relationship with Brown University over the last 4 years. We did a small research project, and we surveyed 62 Rhode Island sex workers, many of them that had worked in New Hampshire. But over the summer of last year, we actually ran a 145-question survey, and we had over 1,500 sex workers from across the country. 54 of them were from New Hampshire who participated. Over the next few months, we'll be analyzing this data, writing a report with policy recommendations. So I know that we can do better. I've also mapped out service providers in Rhode Island. And I think almost every city in the country, the waiting list for housing is years long. other than a bed and a shelter, there's not much of a service that people, even if they want to help people, can offer them. I found out in Rhode Island that we had 320 unlicensed foster homes. And if we want to keep youth out of the sex industry, we need to really step up supporting youth services and looking at harm reduction policies, because when people can't come forward because they're scared they're going to be put under investigation, they're going to be arrested, or they're going to be laughed at in their complaints, the stigma surrounding prostitution has taught society that bad women get what they deserve, and you will get a free pass for anything you do to them. In 2016, more sex workers were murdered in the United States than any other country in the world. But I'll shut up for now, and I'd be glad to take any questions that you have.
Thank you. Questions? Senator.
Thank you for your testimony today. Would you recommend the profession of prostitution to any young boy or girl in this state if the laws were changed?
No. What we do is many people contact us saying, I want to be a sex worker, and we tell them that's not what we do. We don't teach people to do sex work. It's dangerous. There's a lot of illegal jobs within the sex industry, phone sex, cam, stripping. We don't suggest that. We suggest that we support people where they're at. If they're already doing it, we want them to promote policies that ensure their health and safety. Our survey showed us many things that 40% of the women didn't know what PrEP was, which is the drug that could reduce your risk of HIV. Many states have condom for evidence laws, which obviously doesn't promote public health and safety when sex workers, street-based workers are scared to carry condoms. So no, we wouldn't suggest it. We're not promoting, oh, this is what you should do, but we're saying if this is what you're already doing, because as we see, criminalization hasn't made it go away. And over 15 years in New Hampshire, there's only been about 500 arrests. There's about 36 arrests a year. We know there could be tons more. We know they're not policing even 1% of the industry. But no, we're not here trying to recruit sex workers or suggest that in any form. And that was a great question.
Thank you. Senator Harrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What is the breakdown in terms of sexual orientation? Are there...
That is a great question, and the data amazed us. Because when we did the small sample of 62, 82% were white women. And when we did the bigger sample of 1,500, 82% were still white women, but only 40% identified as strictly heterosexual. So we have a huge LGBT, we have trans women. There's even a really good youth report where they went to 6 cities and they studied 1,000 youth between 13 and 24. And no one is suggesting it's appropriate for youth to be involved in this. What they found is the youth are telling them there's so many barriers and criteria that they can't access shelter or other services from the state. So again, if we can provide those services to our youth, and police and sex workers can work together to report trafficking, abuse. When women can work together for their safety without being charged with pandering and promoting in major felonies, we can do a lot of harm reduction. I think that was a great question.
Ms. Larson, you said you were from the organization Coyote. You did not explain what...
Coyote is a group called Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. We're a group of sex workers, former sex workers, and trafficking victims that are advocating for safety and protection for people involved in the sex industry.
Is that a national organization?
We have chapters in LA. We also work with Swap USA, Swap Behind Bars. We provide support to incarcerated sex workers through pen pal programs, mentoring programs, book programs, GD programs. We find out if we build relationships with the women when they're out, they do stay in contact, and we can help them access support services, reentry services as they exit institutions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony today. Leslie Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
My name is Leslie Peterson, and I represent SWAP New Hampshire. SWAP New Hampshire is the New Hampshire affiliate of SWAP USA, which is the Sex Worker Outreach Project. We represent a group of sex workers and their friends and family, and we advocate, educate, and support sex workers and their friends and family. I wanted to thank everyone and tell you how honored we are to be listed as a group of interest in this, and we're happy to provide our experience and our lived experience to this. I want to apologize that we don't have as many sex workers here, because many of the sex workers in New Hampshire do find a public hearing like this very intimidating. There's a lot of risk coming forward and speaking about our lived experience. So when we do, it's because we really care about the topic at hand, and we really care about the research behind it. We're not advocating for decriminalization because we just want it. We're advocating because there's a lot of evidence-based research out there that says this helps the people involved both in consensual sex work and sex trafficking. If there's any questions?
Thank you. Questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Cynthia Macho, I apologize for potentially butchering your name.
Cynthia Maya. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and honorable committee. I'm just here today to represent, I'm from Manchester, New Hampshire, just a citizen, and I'm here to oppose the bill. I have quite the colorful past myself, although I didn't get paid for my services, but I know what it is to be a woman that's caught in sexual addiction. And that's part of what I'm concerned about. I believe that, first of all, it's my understanding with the brief research that I did, I just found out about this yesterday, that there's already been a study to look at all of these different implications. I'm in agreement that there should not be penalties upon the victims. They should not be brought under, most of them are trafficked, most of them are not prostitutes because that's what they've chose, and yet they end up being doubly victimized. And I would like to see a bridge that issue could be dealt with without another study with the intent of decriminalizing prostitution. I'm a grandmother, and as I said, I come from my own background of sexual abuse and the resulting sexual addiction. I know the desperation of that life. I know how that impacts your identity. I know how many years it takes to heal from that and be able to restore and come back to be a functioning woman as God intended me to be. So my major concern is that this impacts the most vulnerable. We're fighting trafficking to a very, very intense degree, and yet we don't seem to be getting a handle on it. The opiate situation in New Hampshire, we all know about how serious that is. And that is a perfect avenue for people to be brought into prostitution because they're out of their minds and they're very vulnerable to whoever it is they're depending upon for their drugs. It also impacts our foster children and other people like myself that were abused by a neighbor or abused by a family member and have their whole identity has been interrupted. So they don't have an identity that causes them to recognize that they're more than a commodity. And that's a major issue as well. When are we going to stop treating human beings as commodities for profit? I want to read something here that these are quotes from actual sex workers themselves, the things that have been said to them. For me, being a prostitute is not a relationship. It's like having a cup of coffee. When you're done, you throw it out, which is exactly how you feel when you're a sex addict as well. You know, we all look for love. We're all looking for relationship and love. And unfortunately, as the song says, we look for it in the wrong places. In our culture today, with the freedom that's gone on with the whole hookup culture, we have an entire generation who has no idea what true love is, what true communication is between men and women. They don't know their identity as women or men. And so for us to continue to move in a direction that supports that, I believe I think it's evil. I'll just say it. I think it's evil. So here's another one. Some of the girls are lovely, but most are just holes too. And you know the word. I'm not going to say it. And here's another one I've actually had things said to me like this. Shut up, get effed, get paid, and F off. That's your job. Not at all demanding. If you're so well educated, get a real effing job, for whores don't know their place. So these are the kind of things that we are supporting when we want to decriminalize prostitution. We're taking the most vulnerable of our children, our youth, and our young adults, where they're not able to make good decisions on their own, and putting them in the hands of people that are using them as a commodity for profit, don't care about them one bit, and then throw them away. And I am very opposed to that. Any questions?
Thank you for your testimony. Questions? Senator Hampton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just curious, are you saying that you think that having a committee to study this would increase sex workers or?
I am. I think, first of all, there's been studies. We've already, for some years I have been aware that those that have trafficked, those who are prostitutes, have then been doubly victimized by, the majority of women are not prostitutes because that's their choice. Their life circumstances put them in a position where now they're under the control of a pimp or somebody else using them as a commodity. And then for them to be doubly victimized by being arrested or put in jail, I would like to see that particular part taken care of. I do not understand why there's a study necessary to spend tax dollars to go back over information that's already, according to the information I've been told, to restudy it. And I'm very concerned about the agenda. There's always an agenda. It's like a bridal dress with a train that's massive, like Princess Diana's, and the bill is never really the bill. It's the things that are on the train that this introductory bill is bringing in. And that's a whole other issue that I would like to see addressed, not only statewide but nationally. But I'm very concerned about the doors that this is opening, and the possibilities of these continual studies where really the goal is complete legalization of prostitution. And I'm absolutely opposed to that. That's what I think it's really about. And we've already had a study. So that's just my opinion. And I appreciate you listening to me. Thank you very much.
I believe we have another question, Senator Janet.
It's not well phrased yet, but I'll work on it as I'm talking to you. I like the idea of, just like we had, I think it was Representative Edwards' bill, and we had a drug bill. And so if there was someone who overdosed, you could call in. I sort of like the idea of a prostitute who beat up, maybe would give her immunity. Those are the things I'd be looking to come out. I certainly would not be for prostitution, but I would like to protect the women in the trade so they could make phone calls and they could not fear the police. That's what I hope would come out of here. Do you think that possibly could come out of this committee?
I'm in agreement with you that anything that helps somebody that's caught in this trade that doesn't want to be, I'm in absolute agreement that those kind of things need to be made available to them. I'm just asserting that there's another way to build a bridge so that what you're concerned about and what many of us are concerned about that's already been stated today about the double victimization of them being arrested and the whole thing. I believe there must be another avenue that could be completely separate from even a hint of legalization of prostitution. I think we have to stand strong as a culture against immorality because it's destroying the family. And that's the foundation of all society is built on family. And I believe prostitution tears down families. So I would like to see other legislation introduced that could address the things that you're concerned about, Senator Gannon, and that many of us have stated regarding the double victimization by them becoming criminals when they're not. They're victims. I just think there's got to be a creative way to address it without a whole new study that really could possibly lean towards the decriminalization permanently as a New Hampshire state law that would make any adult involved on any level with prostitution, it would be legal for them, and I'm absolutely opposed to that.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Darlene Park and Mark Pollock, did you want to come up together?
Sure. Thank you.
Sure.
For the record, my name is Darlene Park. I'm from Raymond, New Hampshire. I am a juvenile sex trafficking survivor, and I have packets of information with lots of statistics and different information for you that, as Cynthia alluded to, this kind of a study has been done. It's been done a lot of times. We have a lot of evidence from various places where it has been decriminalized. In your packet, I'm just going to go through what's in here. There's information from the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. There was a letter from 54 survivors of the sex trade around the country, and then there is another letter from 2 survivors from here in New Hampshire. There's a letter from Awaken, which is from Nevada, where it's decriminalized. Another letter from the National Center on Exploitation, my husband's testimony, and an article on Dignity, a journal on sexual exploitation and violence, written by Lisa Thompson, who is the educational chair of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. And it comes in this handy-dandy folder for you to put all of the other information you have as well. In my experience, briefly, obviously we're not here to discuss my story in particular, but there was a time when I would have told you that I wanted to be a quote-unquote sex worker. We didn't call it that then, but I was 16 years old. Even 17 years old, I knew already that I didn't want to continue in that. A lot of the survivors that have written the letter here, that have signed on to this letter, would have maybe told you the same thing. There's a lot of manipulation that goes on, and there are people who that's what they choose and that's what they want to do. I still would say that we've got a lot of evidence about what decriminalizing prostitution does. We've heard at least a few times today that decriminalizing the sellers in meaning to not arrest them and give them criminal records would be a good idea. It's done in Ohio. It's called prostitution court. There's diversion programs. It's something that is already done. Somebody could just put a bill forward without a study committee asking all of the sex workers here in New Hampshire what they think, because we've got all of the evidence of what happens when we decriminalize prostitution already. I was going to read all kinds of statistics and different things, but I think there's probably enough in the packet that I'm going to save you that. Okay. I'm going to let my husband speak now.
Thank you. You identify yourself for the record.
Yes, Mark Pollock from Raymond, New Hampshire, married to this wonderful lady. So my purpose to come before you today is just to give you some perspective as to what it was like, or what it is like, or what it has been like to be married to somebody that was formerly in the sex business, the sex trade, prostitution. I can say because of that experience that prostitution is bad for people. And there are many avenues in that regard. There are health issues, there's survival issues, but there is also the family issue, the marriage, and the raising of children. And it wasn't too far into our marriage when I began to realize that I was in for something I was completely unprepared for. That the trauma from her experiences, her particular experiences, admittedly, had come to a point in her life where it was affecting our marriage. It was affecting our ability to raise our children. It was affecting every aspect of our life. There was a significant amount of rage depression, anxiety, irritability, confusion, inability to put thoughts together when feeling an emotional strain or stress. And these things tore at the fabric of our family, and to your point, they tear at the family. And I just want to, I skipped over, but I just want to make it, it's an important point that I met Darlene when she was 18, and she had recently exited that particular industry. It wasn't revealed to me at the onset that this was something from her past, but usually that's not first date material. So what was relevant to that is that, and I want to make this point, that she did escape a death sentence as well. She was given by her owner the option of killing her unborn child, or if not, he would take care of the both of them. And she made a daring escape, and fortunately so. We've raised 5 wonderful children together, and they're great contributors to our society. But the main point here is that from a husband's perspective, this is a very difficult thing to transition out of and into a normal, modern-day marriage with all of the accoutrements of a relationship. It really took a lot of time and effort and years for us to work through these issues. And I would say, by the grace of God, we stayed together through those tough years, and we were able to move on.
Thank you, sir. Thank you both. Question? Senator Frank.
Thank you. And thank you for coming today. So to get you right, you believe that decriminalization will cause more harm to those within the trade than the harm done by enforcing current laws?
Full decriminalization, yes. Decriminalizing the sellers, no. I think that a law could certainly be proposed where you're decriminalizing the sellers and still criminalizing the buyers and facilitators so that the demand isn't there. What happens when you have full decriminalization is everybody has whatever they want, and the problem with that is it escalates. So the National Center on Sexual Exploitation has done a lot of studies on pornography, for example, and it escalates. There's a certain percentage of people who will want to go further and further, and novelty is part of our human nature. In my experience, I did have buyers that would just buy me for sex, but a lot of them wanted to rape me, to beat me up, to punish me for whatever reason. I was violently abused many times, and that's that escalation process that happens. So I think full decriminalization would be a very bad idea.
Great. I have a question. This bill is about studying the effects, et cetera, and not necessarily decriminalization. Do you see any value in such a bill or such a study?
The bill, as it sits before you, looks benign, but it was based on a bill that was put forth to decriminalize prostitution. So some of the parties in there, very convincing, very charismatic. What we have to recognize is my husband and I are here today out of work, not doing our regular jobs, at no benefit to ourselves whatsoever. We are never going to make money in the sex trade. That is not why we're here. But there are people who are making money in the sex trade, and they're very charismatic. They are able, and I'm not talking necessarily people in this room, but my pimp was able to convince me to sell my body, the only thing I have that nobody else can have. I sold it repeatedly over and over again, over and over and over, rape after beating after rape, over again. And he convinced me that it was okay, that I could still do it. That's the kind of charisma we're talking about here. So that's who I would like to criminalize, are those facilitators, the pimps and traffickers.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Sarah Palak,
It's very long, very German. Thank you. That's me. I'm honored to be here. Thank you, Chair and committee members. My name is Dina Stahlheber. I am a mother of one 5-year-old and a concerned citizen. I am in opposition of this bill, HB287. As many have said, there is a lot of information about what is, there's a lot of research done. Even the woman from Coyote spoke about some research that is currently being done, as it is in many other places. So I'm confused as to why we need to have more of that. I'm all for research. I think it sounds like there's definitely a lot of things that need to be addressed around the issue of prostitution and decriminalization of that. That is not necessarily my area of expertise, but I am confused as to why there seems to be a bill to have a discussion around existing studies. I don't see why there cannot be a discussion around this. As what someone else mentioned, creating a bridge and having discussion to kind of solve and work together on some of these issues that are clearly affecting many parts of various towns in the state of New Hampshire. It all seems to be related to not only just prostitution, but there's always a relation to drugs, human trafficking, and other issues. So I think that this is a very, very important matter to be looked at, but I'm concerned as to why there needs to be a full bill within the House of Representatives that's kind of moving through now to the Senate to address this topic when we should be able to have these conversations because the information already exists. I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Melissa Ferdinand? Marissa, I apologize. Sorry.
Thank you, Chairwoman, baby senators. My name is Marissa Fernandes. I'm the director of New Hampshire Traffic Free Coalition. I'm also on the New Hampshire State Task Force Against Human Trafficking. And we're hearing a lot of different testimonies today. This is something that I've been studying the topic and teaching on the topic of human trafficking for the past 11 years. And oftentimes what people want to do is separate human trafficking and prostitution, but through my years working with survivors and friends around the country who have been part of the sex trade, have been part of this work, it's a very blurred line. Oftentimes people get lured in, sorry, this is my first hearing. Oftentimes people get lured in to trafficking and then later may leave and start prostituting themselves because that's all they've ever known. They've never had the opportunity to do anything else. And there's the opposite happens as well, where people start off as a runaway or leaving the foster care system and as a way to support themselves will prostitute and then end up getting picked up by a survivor. And that's something that we hear by a trafficker. And that's something that I hear all the time. And when I brought up a couple years ago when this was put forward as to decriminalize prostitution overall, I brought this up to friends of mine around the country, what's going on? What do you guys think about this? And my survivor friends couldn't believe that we were considering a bill that would further exploit women who have been trafficked and also sanction something that says that it's okay to basically exploit women who are in prostitution and say that that's okay. And so that's why I'm here today. I'm trying to think. So also as a mother of 3 boys, I am concerned with them growing up thinking it's okay in our state that you could purchase a woman. And how does this relate to the study? I think that the study, as it stands, I would love to study this, but as the study stands currently, I don't think that we're going to get the outcome that really should be found. I think that there is a lot of the players on the list are still for full decriminalization of prostitution, and I think that this is not the best we can do for the women in our state. I think we do need services desperately. I think we do need exit strategies. I think that having a criminal record is horrible. There are states out there that have, like they said, expungement or courts or different things similar to the addiction community, where you can go through a program, you can actually get help. And I think we absolutely need safe houses, we need situations. If I could support this bill, I would, because this is something I would love to see happen in our state. Other people have talked about studies that are already being done. So the task force is already gathering data, is already researching this topic. And so it is a bit redundant. And I think that I believe that the findings that we will get out of the New Hampshire Anti-Trafficking Task Force will be less biased and will actually protect women. Also, just most of the women that I work with and men around the country who have been in the sex trade experience a great degree of PTSD and trauma that does, similar to what Darlene said, it doesn't go away. It's something they when they've researched it, it's on par with veterans of war, women who've been in prostitution. And to me, it's like how that's not empowering, that's victimizing of women. So, sorry. Another huge concern that I have is in the Netherlands, where the consent age is 16 for sex. They are recruiting kids out of high school to work in their legal brothels in the Netherlands. And I know our consent age is 16, and so I'm not saying that the same thing would happen, but that worries me that there could be an inroad somehow that our children could end up getting exploited as a result of the similar laws on the books. And again, I don't know the details, but I just pose it as a possible concern that it could open the door for, if this is a legitimate job in high school, they could go to work at a brothel instead of go to work at, McDonald's. And so I guess, I could honestly talk about this for hours. I'm a little bit nervous, but finally I would like to end. I don't think any of us want to make New Hampshire a destination state for sex buyers or for sex trafficking, and the unintended consequences that will bring. We've heard word about the expense that comes with arresting and with law enforcement, but there's also expense when you legalize or decriminalize something, because in the state of Rhode Island, the increase when they had legal prostitution or fully decriminalized prostitution for 29 years, they were unable to cooperate with law enforcement, with federal law enforcement when they would come in to do busts, because it was not considered a crime. So that was a huge issue in that state. And so in order to get rid of the full decriminalization of prostitution in the state of Rhode Island, they actually had to wait 29 years and start working cases where people were illegally being brought in from other countries at such an alarming rate that people took notice, and they started actually investigating and finding out how huge of an issue the underground problem was with human trafficking and with the gangs and different circuits that were coming through. And that's a whole other topic of itself, but that is costs our state money as well. So anyways, any questions?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for taking my question. I am curious, because I've heard several people say they think that this committee is biased in one direction. And I'm not seeing it in my reading of it, so I wanted to see where you're seeing.
I don't have the list of reasons here, but I do know, like, for the AIDS organizations, like, typically, which is on there, I can't remember the exact title.
Southern New Hampshire HIV/AIDS.
Yeah, so I know that nationally, the HIV/AIDS organizations think this would be a good thing, because then women would be able to come and get tested for HIV and AIDS. And the way this is looked in other countries, or even in the state of Nevada, the women carry cards saying that they're clean. They get tested every certain amount of week or month to say that they're clean. But what they found is that the men don't have to bring a card saying that they're clean, first of all. And so that's a double standard. And the other thing is that a lot of times men, if they know a woman is clean and that they're not going to get a disease from her, they actually will pay her more or request, demand that she will not wear protection, which puts her at greater risk. So she may not be giving him a disease, but he is giving her a disease. So I'm concerned about that.
Can I follow up, please?
Yes, certainly.
So it sounds to me, from what you're saying and from what I've heard, that sort of decriminalization is sort of not a one-size-fits-all, in that it can be separated into decriminalizing the seller
Yeah.
versus decriminalizing the buyer.
Right.
And is that something you're comfortable with? If this task force came out, and you understand that a committee can't make a law, they just can recommend a law. So is that outcome that you would find to be acceptable?
Again, if I thought that the members on this, I've gone through, I don't have the list in front of me, but talking with people that are nationally been involved in this fight, like globally, they're like, oh no, those are kind of like the who's who of full decriminalization, most of them. And as other people have said, there's been some revisions to the bill, but it still is, when you go through piece by piece, the majority of them are still full, that are on that list are still full decriminalization. And so as the study currently stands, I don't believe that it would give justice or it would give a fair shot to both sides. And as you said, there is different forms. There's the Swedish model, there's France and certain parts of Canada and 7 different countries that have taken on the Swedish model or the Nordic model, or everybody in the human trafficking world almost is in agreement with this, that it's called the abolitionist approach. And that's when you are criminalizing the pimps, the traffickers, the buyers, but you are creating an exit strategy, you not giving a record to the women. And everyone that I know, all the survivors I know are completely in agreement with that. And then there's the full decriminalization, which is basically a more intense form of legalization where it just removes all laws surrounding prostitution. So no longer is it a crime. Like the Netherlands, there's jurisdictions. There's certain protocols that you need to, you have to pay taxes, you have to do these things. If you remove all laws, there is nothing to be investigated. And that, absolutely disagree with. So, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You just referenced earlier the New Hampshire Trafficking Task Force.
Yeah, it's the collaborative. Yeah, I didn't give you the whole.
Who is it? Who put that together? No, they
started out in the AG's office, and then it moved out, and it's the AG is part of the U.S. Attorney. The key players on it for the core members are Manchester PD, who is completely opposed to this, the U.S. attorneys. Child and Family Services.
Are you on it?
Huh? Oh, I am. Yeah. Myself. But for the core, I'm talking about the core members. There's probably like 200 different organizations in this group.
And where are they?
We meet in Concord.
Where are they as far as coming up with a study?
So right now is what we're doing is we're working with Salem University to gather the data. So anything that comes in from Homeland Security or law enforcement, like that's trafficking involved or prostitution, those prostitution cases. Also, the domestic violence centers are reporting their statistics. So they're gathering all that data in order to see like what does the landscape look like in New Hampshire. And we got the grant last October, so it's pretty new. So we're kind of like in process right now. It's a 3-year grant.
Really quick call. So, are you looking into things to protect the women?
Yes.
Such as making, like we talked earlier, making a phone call and if you're looking into any of those options.
Yeah. Currently, we've been doing trainings with law enforcement. We've been doing trainings all over the state in terms of forgetting the terminology, but. Basically, how to work with them, not to do, like. There's basically anyone who's being trained in law enforcement on the topic of human trafficking knows you do not arrest these women. So that is, if you ever hear of arrests happening for women who are being prostituted or in prostitution, that is, they have not been trained yet by our task force because everybody involved is completely sympathetic and compassionate towards this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is this an ongoing task force?
Yes, it is. It's been around for about 5 years. Like I said, it started in AG's and it moved out, and now it's concerned. Like I said, about 200 members of different people from around. So.
Thank you. One more question?
Yeah.
Senator?
Thank you. Considering your group that you represent and the task force you work with, can you think of anyone in that group who had any input into the scope of this proposed legislation and agreed with that?
For what's currently there?
That's being
I do no, not to my knowledge. They were asked to be part of it, but we're not part of it. So, what?
Nor supportive of it.
Nor on the task force, I'm unaware if anyone would have been supportive of it. Previously, I know. Yeah, anybody who is currently on the task force, I don't know of anyone. So, no.
I don't believe there are any further questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Diane Hallenbeck.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a mom of 5. I live in Bedford, New Hampshire. And I would ask that you would oppose the bill because the way it's stated is as a study of decriminalization. And I think the testimonies back and forth are interesting, but I think what I have is a letter you have in your packet, but I just want to read a couple of facts. It's from the letter of the woman who's in Nevada. So they've had, I should put my glasses on, tell you how old I am, raising 5 kids. So they've been having legal prostitution in Nevada for 40 years. They did a Creighton University study, and they looked at the sex market in Nevada, and basically Nevada's number of sex providers per capita is 63% larger than the next largest state. So that's sex providers. And so just to me, I look at, we have 4 boys and a girl. I'm going to cry. But if my daughter is 18, she doesn't like to babysit. So if you legalize or decriminalize prostitution, she could say, well, I don't like working as a babysitter. I don't like working at Inside Scoop, so I think I'll become a prostitute. And that would be not a crime. And so she's in college now, and so this probably isn't going to affect my life, upper middle class, but I grew up in poverty and abusive family. If this would happen in New York State where I grew up, I could have definitely gone into that lifestyle as an option. So I would ask that you would not even consider looking at a study that's about decriminalization overall. There are needs for the women, for sure, but I think decriminalizing gives an option for a young girl with no options into a very dangerous lifestyle. Thank you.
Seeing none. Oh, sorry.
That was a no.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Douglas Wheeler.
Hi, Madam Chair. My name is Douglas Wheeler. I'm a citizen in Manchester, and am here as a private citizen to express my concerns with prostitution, my concerns with the bill. I think in terms of the bill, to save some time, I would agree totally with the representative that spoke opposed to the bill, and I would agree with Darlene Park with what she had to say about why opposing the committee structure. I do believe that we've all heard today that there's a lot of information available for people to go out and actually research and find. And I think we understand that a lot of prostitution are people being prostituted, whether women and, more importantly, children. And I have 7 grandchildren now, I have 5 children, 7 grandchildren, and my concern would be for those granddaughters who are 7 and 4, because the exploitation of children starts earlier and earlier all the time. And I think when we look at, maybe from a common sense standpoint, we know that decriminalizing the seller would be a good thing. We know that criminalizing pimps, traffickers, buyers would also be a good thing. So if we use common sense, do we need to actually put this to a committee to study more of what needs to be done? It sounds like we know what needs to be done. And I would just ask you to think about our children, our grandchildren, our daughters, granddaughters, sons, grandsons, and the women, since there is a high percentage of women that are involved in prostitution, but most of them not of their own doing. I also am, my wife is heading up an outreach in Manchester that actually goes out on the street one day every 2 weeks. And is trying to reach exploited women in Manchester. We know where the areas are in Manchester where they're frequently seen out there working. And I've become exposed in the last 2 years, exposed to a lot of their stories. And it is something that we need to stop. We need to help the exploited people, whether they're boys, whether they're girls, whether they're older women. There's a story to all of them, and a lot of that involves exploitation somewhere along the line. So I've come to see, like in Manchester, that women who are now prostituting themselves, it's because they have no other choice. It's not something they want to do. And so I think we need to look at laws in that sense, that fully decriminalizing prostitution would be a very bad thing. And I think Rhode Island is a good example of that. You know, they finally realized that and changed their laws. Partial decriminalization is probably the way we want to go. But I think we already know that. So I just wanted to express my opposition to the bill.
Thank you for your testimony. Question?
Thank you.
Thank you. You okay? Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is it Susie James, APAC?
Hello, good morning, committee. My name is Susie Q. James, Honorable Chair. Thank you so much for your time. First of all, thank you so much for this hearing. Even starting a conversation about this piece of legislation in an open forum is a huge step forward for the communities I represent and serve. As I said, my name is Susie James. I'm currently serving as the Secretary of the Adult Performer Advocacy Committee. I'm also a member of the Sex Worker Outreach Project. I have been so since 2009. I've been an advocate for the sex working community since 2012, and in that time, I've lost many loved ones. I don't want to be rosy about this, but for me, sex work has been my path to the American dream. I grew up poor, and I'm now able to actually support my family in a way that I never thought was possible. Still, each year, on December 17th, we mourn our dead and read the names of each sex worker who lost their life that year, usually far too young an age. The stigma, which is informed by the criminalization of our work, impedes our access to necessities such as housing, future employment, and health care. As criminalized workers, we cannot seek justice through the criminal defense system and law enforcement without the risk of harassment, arrest, and incarceration. This further enables those who wish to do harm to our community while evading repercussions, as in the case with the Green River Killer, who, after slaying nearly 50 sex workers in the late 1990s, said, "I chose prostitutes because I knew I could kill as many as I wanted and not get caught." He evaded arrest for over a decade. A 2003 report from the Urban Justice Center and New York City Sex Workers Project found that the overwhelming majority of workers surveyed did not feel safe reporting crimes to the police, and the few who had done so reported being turned away and told they deserved all they got. Currently, traffickers and pimps and others who wish to exploit our community can leverage the criminalization of our work in order to keep victims isolated and afraid of arrest and incarceration. It happens all the time, as you've heard from both sides. The Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women, Amnesty International, of course, the World Health Organization, and many other human rights and public health organizations recommend the decriminalization of sex work worldwide as a way to curb human trafficking and curb the spread of HIV and AIDS. When Rhode Island decriminalized sex work from 2003 to 2009, the entire state saw a drop in instances of rape by 31%, and women in the state saw nearly a 40% drop in STI transmission. There can be a better way. New Hampshire has a tremendous opportunity with this bill to take an intersectional approach to analyzing the ample evidence at hand and decide if the current system is indeed serving victims and vulnerable workers. I know that big change like this takes time, which is why HB287 is a measured and reasonable step forward. As you've heard, there's a strong interest on both sides to find a way to serve the workers and victims who are currently at risk. And some flavor of decriminalization is one strategy that both sides seem to be interested in. I think this committee will allow all parties to find compromise and solutions. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Do you have any idea, to the number, I don't know if you would, how many people are in our jails and prisons today because of being convicted of sex work?
I do not have that information in front of me, sir. I would be happy to follow up with you. I do know that we incarcerate more people than pretty much any other civilized nation, and a huge amount of folks are in there due to sex-related crimes. We have a representative from SWAP behind bars speaking who may be able to answer that more fully, Professor Jill Kraken. Absolutely, and I think she can probably answer that for you.
Thanks.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Please.
Senator, thank you. I'm just going to ask the same question I asked before, which is, in your opinion, what about this, because you're on the other side of the issue, what about this?
In some ways. I'm on the side of victims and workers. There's no,
I'm
we all are.
thinking of the other person I asked, but
Right.
are there people on this list that would be recommended to be on the committee that you would see as more one-sided than the other?
Sure, law enforcement. I mean, and not to say that in a terrible way, but currently there's funding in place for law enforcement to, go after stings in this particular way. I have a close friend who's a survivor of trafficking and works in Florida, and she does training with law enforcement to say, hey, how do you identify a sex trafficking victim? No, not just any person selling sex, not a prostitute of any kind. Someone who is specifically being trafficked, and 9 times out of 10 they don't understand. They say, oh, she's a girl standing on the street. Oh, a brown woman. So much of this, the way it's currently enforced is through profiling. Trans women are twice as likely to be arrested than cis women. So I think that I wouldn't say we shouldn't have law enforcement. I would never say that. I think that we need to have everybody at the table talking these issues out, because that's how it gets done. It's very nice to come here to hearings and have our side speak and have their side speak, but what we need to be is in community, in collaboration, finding real solutions that work. And I think this bill will do that. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
David Kutar?
I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm here to support this bill mostly because, she just hit it out of the park. I thought the lady in blue, I thought she should communicate with the proposers of this bill. I mean, communication is what it's all about. That's what the whole bill is for. More communication, more information exchanges, and perhaps this is basically a study committee right here, really. I mean, we're all learning about this and that, and there's some very informed people here. For me, it's violence. There's violence associated. There's violence. I mean, everybody knows that pimps supposedly beat up prostitutes. I mean, that's keep them in line, stuff like that. And so this committee to stop that violence is the whole thing for me, really. I mean, that's the whole thing. And prostitution is is sort of a hidden thing. It's like sunshine. Sunshine helps take that violence away, and so it needs to be looked at and brought out. So let's see. Is there anything else? The people that are coerced into doing it, whether it be younger, a younger or older, being able to have the ability to say no to people, that those prostitutes or whatever you want to call them have to be able to say no, and then if they get the law behind them, they can say no, and they won't get beat up and say yes you will. You know what I'm saying? So basically that's my whole thing. I hope you vote for it, and that's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair called Shannon McGinley.
Thank you for committee members for allowing me the opportunity to speak this morning. I had written testimony that I was going to submit, and after listening to the testimony before me, I don't want to waste anybody's time and repeat that which has already been said, but I also want to clarify some other things that have been said. So I will submit my written testimony via email after the fact. So I'm the executive director of Cornerstone Action. I'm a volunteer. But Cornerstone urges legislators to reject the committee report and instead vote inexpedient to legislate on HB 287. When the bill was introduced and throughout the work sessions this fall on the bill, Cornerstone urged the bill shift its focus to study human trafficking in New Hampshire. We also urge that legislators explicitly reject redefining prostitution as a type of regulated industry or so-called sex work. The amendment recommended by the committee is well-intentioned, but it fails to address our concerns with the underlying bill. The survivors were added very recently when many of the other groups are very much pro full decriminalization. I'm concerned that the survivors were not a priority initially when the bill was created. The bill is introduced. The proposed study committee would consult with organizations that support legalized sexual exploitation, and is often the case with study committees. The desired conclusion of the committee is obvious from the way the committee is set up and given its charge. I want to make it very clear that status quo is not okay, what we have right now. We are very concerned about the women that are trapped in this world of prostitution and trafficking. And we believe much of what, for example, Darlene Park, the survivor, said, that there needs to be a focus on the Johns or the users and providing opportunities to be able to help the women. I think that when it is illegal, it provides an opportunity for the police to be able to save a woman from a situation. And I'm not saying that right now that the infrastructure that is currently in place is set up properly throughout the state in order to support those women and to give them the help that they need, in particular if they are feeling trapped. I think some communities do a better job of it than others. And I do think that there should be a dialogue on how we can truly help them. I also, furthermore, as a part of my testimony, I wanted to point out that on January the 2nd, Governor Sununu said that he would veto the bill, and he said, quote, "There are those in the legislature that want to explore legalizing prostitution. I am 100% against it and would veto the bill if it reaches my desk." And previously, there was testimony alluding to the fact that he may have changed his mind on this, or is that he was thinking about changing his mind. And I just want to note that he did sign in opposed here since the hearing has started. A part of my testimony was actually his press release, so I can still go ahead and submit that, even though I would submit the rest of my written testimony via email then.
So, anything further?
Nope, that's all. Please oppose HB 287.
Thank you for taking my question.
Yes.
Would you be opposed to a bill that was asking for studying sex trafficking and looking at it sounds like there are two different kinds of decriminalization.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, partial or full.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I've heard it described.
Or Nordic model, or yeah.
Yeah. So is the Nordic model the
partial?
Partial. Is that your primary concern, or are you mostly saying that you just don't want a study?
To be honest with you, I'm not fully knowledgeable about the consequences of the partial, but I think that is missing in this study, that kind of conversation. I would like to understand more about the Nordic model. It seems to be favorable by many who are that support those in trafficking. I feel like that there's a lack of emphasis on the Johns and the users of it, and I feel like there should be more of a focus on them. So I'm not really prepared to say that I fully support the partial decriminalization, but I would like to learn more about it. It seems like it's pretty complicated, and there's not been a lot of longitudinal studies on it, but I'm intrigued by it.
Okay.
But I definitely am in opposition in the direction that it currently seems that this study committee is going into.
Thank you.
All set. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, coming down to the wire, the chair calls Meredith Cook.
Good morning. My name is Meredith Cook. I am the Vice Chancellor of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Manchester, and on behalf of Bishop Labashi and the Diocese of Manchester, I come before you to oppose HB 287. The Catholic Church's concern about this bill is rooted in our belief in the dignity of every human person and our commitment to protect vulnerable people, and especially from threats to human dignity. The protection of individuals from human trafficking is a significant priority for the diocese. We have been doing significant education and outreach on human trafficking at a diocesan level, but in our parishes, in our schools, through Catholic charities. This has been a significant priority for the diocese, and we launched a significant campaign on the diocesan level and had a conference last year. We've been hearing from victims of human trafficking, victims of sex trafficking, from law enforcement, from the U.S. Attorney's Office, from a number of different individuals. And one of the things I wanted to point out as I was hearing some of the questions and information is that law enforcement, what we've been hearing, law enforcement has been reaching out to victims of sex trafficking in particular, and trying to get some outreach. I'm not a member of law enforcement, but this is certainly one of the things that we've been hearing. And one of the frustrations that they find is that when they do reach out and try to let people know, so it's certainly not always a situation of law enforcement trying to go out and bust people all the time, but they are out on the streets trying to work with victims. They know that people in the sex trafficking area are victims, and that what they face in terms of addiction and how people are enslaved is a crisis. But one of the things that you did hear that I really want to reiterate is that there is an active human trafficking coalition, a task force already in New Hampshire that has that expertise in place, that has law enforcement, that has child services, that has experts. You heard how many numbers of people that have the expertise that's already in place in New Hampshire that's looking at how to address these issues. And I don't mean disrespect to the legislators who could look at this issue, but we already have people who are looking at this. If there is legislation that could grow organically from that, if there are services that could be provided, if there's information that could be provided, that could be provided from those organizations. So I'm very concerned about trying to do two things at the same time. We urge you to oppose House Bill 287, also in very large part because of our concern about the message that this would send. When the legislature studies an issue, it sends the message that it provides a credible issue, that this is an occupation that's worthy of study, that it would send the message to individuals who wish to exploit individuals that this is an occupation that's worthy of study in New Hampshire. So we urge you to oppose House Bill 287. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Questions for Cook?
Thank you.
Thank you again. I'm sorry, I cannot read the name. The last name looks like Palak. Did you wish to speak? You did not? You do? Okay, thank you. Sarah.
Yes, sorry. Dr. Sarah Palak. I work here in New Hampshire. I'm a professor. And I have a PhD studying sex work policy and sex work lives from the University of Manchester in England. I've studied sex work in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I've studied sex work in Scotland. I've studied sex work in England. And I moved back to the States. I'm a native of Massachusetts. I moved back to the States a couple of years ago. And I've been working with two organizations, mostly in Massachusetts. One is one that's already been mentioned, SWAP. It's actually it's an international organization with a strong national presence here in the States. So I work specifically more so with the SWAP Boston chapter, and affiliated with that chapter because of the difficulties of being politically present as a sex worker in many of the states here in America. We created an allies organization called Massachusetts Allies Sex Workers Network. So I'm a part of those organizations. And I actually when I started studying sex work about 10 years ago, I really sympathize with a lot of the views that have been expressed in this room so far about the specific harms and moral sort of depravity of the sector. And then as I continued studying and speaking with sex workers and speaking with people who worked with sex workers and speaking with politicians, it became clear to me that it's a very complex social phenomenon and it's very messy. But that most women and men who are engaged in sex work see it primarily as a means to an end. They see it as a job. And like any of us who have jobs, there are things that we find difficult or boring or problematic about that job. So I am part of a very strong and very worldwide research community who has been producing many studies about the impacts of different legal models on sex working lives. And as far as I know, the only place in this world where sex work has been decriminalized and where sex workers have been part of that process of looking at what decriminalization would look like, as this bill is suggesting, is New Zealand. And for the most part, everything that is coming out of that area says that the sex workers there are much more empowered in their work. They feel much safer. They are able to negotiate with law enforcement from a much better position. And I am not a numbers person, so I can't just say, like, you know, off the top of my head, X amount of transmissions of STI and things have gone down. But basically, the perils of the industry that are largely a product of criminalization and the need to stay underground have been immensely reduced. Now, other areas in the world, and I believe that this study would look into that, have considered other models and have enacted other models. So the Netherlands, for example, is not an example of decriminalization, as I would say it. It's an example of legalization. And the idea there is that not only you do decriminalize the selling and buying of sex, but then you also reintroduce specific regulations that the workers would need to, and the clients would need to sort of adhere to. And in the production of that legislation about 20 years ago, it was mostly the brothel owners who were part of that process. It was not sex workers. And then you can look at the Nordic model, it's so affably called. It's a bit of a misnomer. I would call it demand-side prohibition. And that specifically looks at how, that specifically decriminalizes the selling of sex and criminalizes the purchase of sex. And there actually has been longitudinal studies just emerging now. That legislation was put into effect about 11, 12 years ago, and there's actually a large body of research that has emerged now since looking at that. I actually just reviewed a book the other day about it. So, So my research specifically looks at organizations, primarily health-based organizations and social work-based organizations that work with sex workers. And what my research shows is that the sex industry, again, is very varied. But a lot of the descriptions of women and men who have engaged in the industry as depicted as drug addicted, highly exploited, working on the streets, tend to represent a very small fraction of the agency, not very much. And there's questions, by the way, and service providers take this very seriously, about whether or not you can attribute engagement in the sex industry directly to something like opioid addiction. There's a chicken or egg problem there, that when you try to create a linear connection between them, you actually end up really possibly delivering and adjusting and designing services that don't actually meet the needs of that person. So the idea that women are engaging in sex primarily because of sex work or commercial sex center, primarily because of addiction or primarily because of sexual addiction, is a massive distortion of the problem, of the phenomena. Most women see it as a job and as a means to an end. And it is primarily an occupation, and I think some of the numbers, again, which are iffy because it's difficult for people to be upfront and open about what they're doing, but the numbers are showing slight, not necessarily increase, but changes in how the industry is structured. So there's been a huge move over the past 50 years from on-street, sort of more located in working class areas, to the internet and to indoor venues, and a lot of use of the internet. But what is clear is that women and men who engage in sex work, when you ask them, they're doing it because of a broad, a labor market that is just precarious. It is difficult to find part-time work, especially if you're a mother, that is as remunerative as sex work can be. My research shows that law enforcement are harmful. When law enforcement conduct crackdowns in areas, women will not come forward to services that they might need to stay safe or to address violence that they might be experiencing. The pimp is actually a creation of the law. It didn't exist until the late Victorian era, when it became illegal for women to be living by themselves. And that was put into place precisely because women who were living in groups together were running brothels. And the law a law was put in place that made it necessary for women to sort of live with a man, and that man essentially became her pimp. So the culture of disposability that has been referenced throughout this hearing, I do completely agree that exists, and I would say it's largely a product of criminalization.
So, excuse me.
Yes.
A lot of what you're telling us, I think, is for the study committee.
Sure.
If you could just, sum up how you feel it would be important. I imagine you support the bill.
Yes, I do support the bill. My apologies I didn't make that clear. So why do I think we need to support this bill? It's because decriminalization is a specific legal model, and the specific impacts that it will have in New Hampshire need to be explored. Throughout this hearing, we've heard a conflation between, and we've also heard people, we've heard a conflation between sex working and trafficking. So this task force that one of the women mentioned earlier, they have done studies, and they've done them from the perspective of trafficking. And that is, to my mind, a particular bias. All right? And we have not considered, they have not looked at what the effects of decriminalization are. And that needs to be considered here in New Hampshire. I think that's all I should say to that fact. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for most informative.
Okay.
Dr. Jill McCracken?
You guys have been sitting for a long time, huh? Thank you so much for hearing this. My name's Dr. Jill McCracken. I'm a professor at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg, and I've spent over 14 years researching sex work and trafficking in the sex industry. I'm also the co-founder and co-director of an organization that works directly with people who are incarcerated and have engaged in sex work, have been trafficked, and also have been convicted of trafficking. So there's all these areas, right, that we work with directly. I have some notes that I can share with you later. I know you could not possibly read my writing, but I want to clarify a couple things because I've heard so much today, which is really great. One of the things that I like about this bill, and by the way, I'm speaking in support of it, is that it's looking at the issues related to changing prostitution laws. So I think that's a really important distinction to make. It's not looking at what would decriminalization do, right? It's looking at the issues related to changing prostitution laws. And I think that looking at prostitution laws directly impacts trafficking. So this study group can do more, I think, than the task force can do by looking only at trafficking. I think we have to look at prostitution laws if we're going to solve the problems related to trafficking. We know that trafficking exists, and we know that people engaged in prostitution exist. We also know that there is a continuum. People move in and out of consensual prostitution and to be forced. This happens. We know people that do this. I know many people. So we need to better understand the relationships that are created with prostitution laws, and this study group will do that, and that's why I'm very much in support of it. I also think that, as many people have said, a criminal record follows you forever, right? And many individuals cannot find mainstream jobs. So in many cases, again, an impact of criminalization or the criminal laws that New Hampshire currently has in place, we need to better understand that. How does that impact people as they move forward? You, sir, had asked a question about the number of people that have been incarcerated. In the 70s, which was a long time ago, I was around. 75% of the women were charged with prostitution charges. We know that last year, and this is really, really hard to tell, but we know that last year at least 70,000 people were charged with prostitution charges in the country, right? But again, there are many, many people who are living in incarceration who have drug charges, but they've still been engaging in prostitution, and I would say are trafficking victims. We know people who have prostitution charges who are certified trafficking victims who have never been identified as a victim. So what they are is they have these prostitution charges again and again and again. If they're lucky enough, quote unquote, to escape trafficking and finally be identified as a victim, the state of Florida actually allows vacatur laws where some of these other sentences can be taken away if you've been considered a certified victim, right? So we know that people are living in both spaces. I find this an opportunity, and I know it's really complicated, and that's part of the reason why I think this study group is so necessary. You guys have an opportunity to allow this study group to go forward, and that could be phenomenal, not just for the state of New Hampshire, but for the country. We need to better understand trafficking. The status quo, as someone said, is not working, and we will not arrest our way out of this problem. So part of what this study does, as someone else said, an intersectional approach, what is causing people to go into it? We can better understand that. How do we help people get out of it? How can we help them find other choices if they don't want to be in it, which there are people who don't. So I feel like the study group can answer a lot of questions, and it's not necessarily stating decriminalization. It can answer a lot of different questions for us. And I think New Hampshire can be at the forefront of creating this conversation. It's a conversation that drastically needs to change in our country.
Thank you. Thank you. There are a couple issues that keep coming up that I'm trying to understand.
Okay.
And the first one seems to be that there's a preconceived bias about what this committee is trying to study, based on perhaps the original title of the bill, and I don't know enough about the original bill to know where that preconceived notion idea comes from. But I also feel as though there is that part of it has not just with the title, but part of the problem has to do with the composition of the group. And from what I've heard so far, there are people on both sides of this issue who see the list as biased in one way or another. So I'm having a little trouble understanding what the ideal list of members, which seems like the best way, not the title of the bill, but the best way would be to talk about the members of a committee. I'll tell you, I am biased in favor of studying things. So, but I do want to be sure. I mean, I don't think we should study things if we already know where we're going with it.
Absolutely.
So have you seen the list? And
Yes.
do you have some feelings about why? I mean, this is maybe a New Hampshire issue, but still.
I think your point is really, really well taken. First of all, as a researcher, right, and as a mother, I'm also very interested in studying things. That's my bias. I think studying things is important, not ad nauseum, right? We need to study and then move forward. I think the research questions that we ask absolutely direct the answers that we're going to find, which is why I like the wording of this study group, because it's to talk about the effects of prostitution laws, right? And that is for trafficking and prostitution. So I think that's really, really important. It's looking at the laws. And for a group of legislators to do this is phenomenal. It's phenomenal. I wish that you had millions of dollars and you could hire researchers to do this work, because it's a project. But you could find out so much wonderful information. And one of the things that's really, really important is putting the voices. I don't know when the survivors were added to this list, but I do know absolutely that sex workers and survivors have to be at the forefront of this. And the study allows you guys a glimpse into those voices, right? So in terms of this list, my understanding is this list is not definitive, end all be all. And I feel like everyone has a bias. Everyone has a bias, right? As Susie stated, the police department. I don't know why the task force would not also be on this list, right? I think they are someone that should be in the game. So I don't think this list is definitive, but I obviously was not in charge or responsible for creating that list.
My previous question as to how many people were incarcerated within New Hampshire.
Oh, I
In New
apologize.
Hampshire, not nationally, was because I'm hearing that because of the criminalization, the crime of prostitution, these girls are afraid to report pimps that are beating them and forcing them into the sex business. I've met a lot of police officers in the last 3 years through here, and I can't see where one of them would arrest a woman who came in to complain because her pimp was beating her and arrest her for prostitution. And that's what I was curious, does that happen, or is that just a story?
Well, I think that it happens. I cannot speak for New Hampshire, which is why I think your study group is so important. But I will say that we find again and again, I teach classes at the college level and graduate level on sex work and trafficking, and I read many reports, and we find that children, young people, victims of domestic trafficking, state that police officers are one of the things they're the most afraid of, not because of arrest, but because of exploitation. So not just that they're going to be arrested, but that they're going to be further exploited. And people do know that.
By the police
By the
themselves?
police. By the police themselves, yes.
I find that difficult to believe in New Hampshire, but...
And I would love for that not to be the case. I hope that it's not. I'm happy. My colleague may actually have some stats on New Hampshire, and I can look them up and get back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. One last person, Connor.
Sorry, it said to print tonight. It's still my first name.
Oh, I thought it was an interesting name.
No.
Connor.
And your first name is?
Connor. That is my first name. I would like to not provide my last name if possible. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Connor. I wasn't planning on speaking today, so sorry if my testimony isn't quite as organized as the others here. I'm 19 years old, born and raised in Manchester, and I'm a sex worker. So I think I have sort of a unique perspective into this. One, I'm speaking, yes, we need to pass this bill. I think everyone today has at least got the idea that something needs to change. What is going on right now with full criminalization benefits no one. Even right now, currently the sex work that I engage in is fully legal. I don't physically touch anyone. I do my work over the internet and things like that. And even then, I do not necessarily feel safe coming to the police in order to address your concerns. No, I don't. Even though my work is all legal, I do not feel safe coming to the police if I were to learn that another worker was underage or something like that, or that someone was being harmed. I don't feel I could safely go to the police without the possibility of being harassed, without my name being put on records for being basically I don't want to say extorted, but saying, oh, sorry, I'm discombobulated, but the gist is, no, I do not feel safe coming to the police if necessary. So something needs to change, especially, for those who are engaging in currently illegal activities. There's a lot of concern over the list of organizations that are on here, and as somebody who's involved, I don't see how this is biased. On the list is New Hampshire Association of Chiefs of Police, Child and Family Services, New Hampshire Legal Assistance, the American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International. How are these organizations biased? These are, Amnesty International is one of the largest organizations in the world working to protect people from all sorts of things, political prisoners, sex workers, just generally disadvantaged people, survivors of sex trafficking, individuals who are or were engaged in consensual sex work. I think it's a bit absurd to say that this is biased. I think that many people are turned off by, the Sex Workers Outreach Project. How is getting the opinion of current sex workers or former sex workers, how is that biased? We are the people who are most involved, and all too often when we see the creation of legislation regarding sex workers, we see a lack of involvement from sex workers, which is, normally when you're working with a group to try to help or something like that, you'd want their opinion. That's just kind of how it works. So that's how you formulate things. You learn. That's how you learn about government and everything. Everybody has a process. There's involvement from the community. Also in the bill, line 27, the committee may solicit advice or testimony from any interested party, including but not limited to. So this list can be actively, added to as the committee feels necessary. I don't see why there's any reason to not pass this bill in its current wording. We all agree that something needs to change. Personally, I am for decriminalization. I'll make that known. Full decriminalization, simply because I know from my work and from others' experience that there's other, even just partial decriminalization models. The work is going to continue, and it actually makes the work more dangerous when you actively pursue people who clientele and those who would otherwise purchase sex work. So that's just my opinion right now. I'm open for questions. So once again, sorry if I'm excited or discombobulated or anything, but yes.
Thank you. Kind of questions? No? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
I believe everyone who has wanted to speak has had the opportunity to do so. Am I correct? Therefore, I close the hearing.